Dave Del Grande joining us on 95.7 The Game. Hey, Dave, thanks for joining us, man. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I mean, you knew Don Nelson, extremely well. I know that you kept in touch with him after, you both, stopped doing what you were doing, and you went down to Hawaii a few times. Just tell us about Don Nelson and the Don Nelson you knew.
Well, one of the most generous and nicest men I've ever met. And like you said, I speak mostly about him off the court than on the court. But even when he was coaching, he was very generous. I can't tell you the number of times when the Warriors had a homestand. And, it was an open invitation to the media, at least to some of us, to come join him down at Ricky's. Where he'd be watching games with Donnie and Ed Gregory and, sometimes St. Jean. And we'd go down there on, Tuesday nights. We'd watch a doubleheader on TV, enjoy beers, all you can eat. I mean, I never paid a cent. And the funny thing about that is that it was never a situation where he was giving away trade secrets. Don Nelson was one of these guys, and I'm not saying this is necessarily unique. A lot of heck, Matt, probably you fit into this category as well. He could absorb information. It didn't matter how many people were talking to him, how many people were laughing in the background, how many beers he'd had. He could absorb information with the best of them. And just in watching, like I said, there was never one time during, probably, 100, 200 times that we did this. And where he would say out loud, oh boy, look at Nash. He can't go to his left. We need to do, write that down, Eddie. Let's put that in our scouting report. It just became a part of, his knowledge of the game. I've like you said, I played golf with Don. Oh my God. I gotta say 200 times. And there were, during the off season, he would, he lived in Alameda, right? I lived in Hayward. Steve Tatey covered the team for the Contra Costa Times a lot. Steve was a very good golfer. But, literally, Don, almost every single day of the offseason, Don would call me at 8 a.m. and say, where are we golfing today? And I said, Don, you're the one with the contacts. I can't make this decision. You need to tell me what course can you get us onto for free. And Don would basically said, well, that's unlimited. I can get us onto any course. And then I would say, well, we haven't been to the Olympic Club in a while. And Don would say, okay, let me make a call. And he'd call me back in 10 minutes and say, okay, pick me up at 9 or we're tee off at 10. Where's Katie play today? And almost literally every single day of the off season. And like I said, we never, we could have shared a card 150 different times. He never once said anything about basketball. Wow. It was just all about, a friendly round of golf. He always had a little wager going on
sure.
the side. And same thing, again, if I play golf with Don, 150 times, you can count on less than one hand the number of times that I paid the green fees.
Wow. I love that. Dave, real quick here, I have a character flaw. I'll ask you a question, and before you answer, I'll give you my answer. So I'm not going to do that here. But I was just thinking driving in when I got the news yesterday, do you think Nelly was properly appreciated for his coaching career, or will people appreciate his influence more now that he's gone?
You're not going to answer that?
No,
you're not feeling good today, or what?
No, I have the answer. I don't want to give it to you before you answer.
To be honest with you, I think he's gotten probably too much credit over the years, because not because he didn't deserve a lot of credit. But, he's considered one of the great coaches of all time, and everybody you talk to, I heard your interview with Tim Hardaway a little earlier. I mean, everybody loves the guy, whether you played for him or not. Even guys who played for him for 1 year, maybe just an Olympic, Olympic thing, whatever it might have been. Everybody who played for him loved him for the most part. But, let's be honest, he never won a championship. And he, his teams, he coached the Warriors 10 years and they made the playoffs 5. I mean, don't quote me on those exact numbers, but, half the time they made it, half the time they didn't. You don't, to be considered a great coach or baseball manager or whatever you want, batting 50-50 like that, making the playoffs when, basically half the league's making it. You don't see a whole lot of those guys getting the accolades that Nelson has gotten. But, that said, I compare the Warriors situation when I covered the team to the Utah Jazz. The Utah Jazz at that time had Stockton and Malone, and Jerry Sloan was the coach. And they made the playoffs every year. They made the finals twice. They dominated the Warriors. They overpowered the Warriors a lot, except for one playoff series. And yet, Jerry Sloan has a far better winning percentage than Don. Has far better playoff, numbers than Don. And yet, you ask anybody in the NBA world, who is the better coach? There's just no comparison. Don Nelson gets far greater accolades than Jerry Sloan. And so to me, I got no problem with that because, I think I've said this back then and I still would stand by it. Man, I wouldn't trade those 10 Nelson years for any 10 Sloan years. I don't care how many times Utah made the playoffs. They bored people to death. Whereas the Warriors, the great thing about the Warriors is you say, well, geez, Nelson, he basically had a 500 record here or whatever. But because of their style of play, the Warriors dictated, even against the best teams, whether they won or lost. If the Warriors came out and they were hitting all their shots and running up and down the court, it didn't matter how good the opponent was. The Warriors, were going to beat you. Now, unfortunately, because they played no defense, the nights when they weren't shooting 55%, which was half the time. Well, guess what? They had very little chance of winning those games. But it's kind of a unique thing where you're not as good as, 10, 12 different teams in the league. But yet, every time you take the court, you got a chance to win that game if Mully's on tonight, if Richmond's on tonight, if Hardaway's on tonight. We're going to win this game based strictly on the fact that our coach is willing to be a little different and put us in a situation where, you give us a chance to win.
Dave Del Grande joining us on 95.7 The Game, longtime beat writer for the Oakland Tribune, covered Don Nelson during his career and also became friends with Don Nelson over the years. When I came on in the mid-'90s, Nelson had a great relationship with a big core of the writers. I know you guys talked off the record frequently. I mean, were there ever any instances where Don got mad at you for what you wrote?
Yes. One in particular. I mean, it didn't happen a whole lot, right? But one in particular, I never really appreciated how much he denigrated his big men. Now, granted, they weren't great, right? They weren't great players. But you know what? Chris Gatling and Victor Alexander, Tyrone Hill, these guys poured their heart and soul into being the best being the best possible big man they could, knowing that they were going up against David Robinson and Duncan and Shaq, and having very little chance in those matchups. Well, I remember on one road trip that I took, the Warriors had played, I want to say, against the Nets and lost. And after the game, Don just ripped into Gatling and Alexander about how poorly we need to rebound better. These guys were terrible, and it's like, they're you're expecting Gatling to out rebound Derek Coleman. No, that's not going to happen. He's guarding the wrong guy. Should be guarding a smaller guy. And so it bothered me. And then the next night they played in Atlanta, and game went into overtime. And the game went into overtime, and Don just sat there and let Tim Hardaway dictate whether they were going to win or lose. They didn't run any plays, and they took terrible shots in the overtime, and they lost. And so afterward, I wrote this story about how what a terrible game he coached. And I said, to be honest with you, the only reason the game went into overtime was because his assistant coach, Popovich, tugged on his jacket a couple of times and told him to wake up, and so then we get, 2 nights later, they're playing at Detroit. Well, it just so happened that because of the finances of the paper, I had to fly to Boston and then drive to Detroit for this next game. In fact, Steve Cady and I did it together, to save money for our papers. And so I got to Detroit pretty late. I mean, like an hour before the game. And as soon as I got there, Popovich comes up to me, right? I mean, because you're preparing for the game. Popovich, he's serious. He's not going to talk to anybody before the game. He sees me, coming, sitting down in the press room or at the press table, or wherever. He says, "Hey, I need to talk to you." And I said, "Sure, all right, great. What about?" We step aside over in a corner, and he says, Nelly's all pissed off. He read your article from the Atlanta game, and he says that's a bunch of baloney. And he sent me over to talk to you. Popovich, and this was some flunky that he sent over there. And I said, "Hey," "tell me you didn't pull on his jacket a couple of times during that game." And he laughed, and then, Nelson always forgotten, the next day. So, yeah, he did every once in a while get a little angry, even with guys like me who, didn't, but let's be honest, I wasn't the one out there breaking, big stories like Bucher and Steinmetz and these enterprising guys who were really the guys causing trouble.
Oh, man, Dave, a bunch of good stuff. Keep it going. Hey, let me ask you this. When people look back, let's just say 40 to 50 years from now, what do you think they should remember most about Don Nelson, not just as the coach, but the man?
Well, I mean, the more you got to know him off the court, the greater your appreciation of him was, because as great a coach as he was far greater than that off the court. And like I said, just an incredibly generous man. I mean, who was I? I mean, I wasn't a big time, sports writer. I wasn't a guy that he needed to, offer free rounds of golf so that, to be my friend or whatever. I mean, it was the other way around. It was like every time he called, it was like, wow, Don Nelson's on the line. Excuse me, I need to step into the other room. I just think that every time that we'd go out, it just seemed that, even in Hawaii, where he was, at least initially, he wasn't all that well recognized. But as soon as one person recognized him, and then, so we're talking 40 years ago, right? Things were different back then. You treat celebrities today a little bit more, different. You see LeBron James walking down the street, and 90% of the people not only are, recognizing him, but are hounding him. Back then, Don Nelson could could play a round of golf, and maybe 10 people would recognize him. But I'll tell you what, he went out of his way to meet 10 more. And he was this supersized, bigger than life figure that, maybe if you didn't know him, you were hesitated walking up to him. I don't want to interrupt, some of these coaches these days, some of these players these days, who knows, what they're going to say to you or walk the other way. Oh, he was just incredibly kind to, a funny story that I have, again, I'm a nobody, right? Don liked me because we were similar golf scores. So we could play a nice competitive match. So one time he invites me over to Hawaii for a week to golf with him, right? And so I go over there, and I get there, and Don picks me up at the airport, and he's not headed in the right direction, right? And I said, Don, where are we going? And he says, well, they're renovating my house. And I thought, oh, great. You didn't tell me I was going to have to pay for my hotel. Not sure I have enough money for this, And so, and Don says, I'm going to put you up with one of my friends if that's okay. And I said, oh, geez, this does not sound good. Does the guy even know you're dropping me off on his doorstep? Turns out it was Willie Nelson. He takes me down to Willie Nelson's castle, and didn't even see Willie. Don basically opened the door and said, okay, we're here. Go in and find your room. Like, but this isn't a hotel, it was, and I stayed, so I stayed in Willie's place for an entire week. Now, I probably saw him twice the entire, I wasn't about to go downstairs if he had guests or whatever. I had no interest in getting to know Willie Nelson or bothering him or whatever. I just felt, okay, you're going to be in this North Castle over here, this tower. Okay. And then 8 a.m., Don called and said, okay, I'm outside picking you up. Let's go golf. And then 10 p.m. after 2 rounds of golf and free lunch and free dinner, drink everything we could, I could drink. He dropped me off on Willie's doorstep again and said, okay, I'll call you tomorrow at 8. But just, my point is he probably could have done that with 15 other friends,
wow.
That he had. And this was just, like I said, this isn't Milwaukee where, he probably everybody in town knew him. This was on an island where 95% of the people had no idea who he was.
Right. Hey, Dave, I have a vague recollection of him getting mad at you once because you said something like you compared him to Guy Lewis, who was the Houston Cougars coach. They must have. You said something about he just rolled the ball out, and I think he got mad at you.
Yes, that is true. I didn't necessarily think that was a bad thing. I mean, crying out loud, Guy Lewis, Coach Phi Slam at JAMA, to their greatness. Their styles were similar. Obviously, Guy Lewis had Elijah Wan playing center for him, and Don didn't. But they played a fun style like that. I do remember one time saying that, and then trust me, I never said that a second time.
Wow. Hey, Dave, man, thank you so
much.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Great stuff. This is what people love to hear, man. So really appreciate you coming on with us and giving us your time.
Well, man, I've got a million Nelson stories, and, unfortunately, he's not with us anymore, but I'll tell you what, he's going to be with me the rest of my life. Because, awesome. People love hearing his stories, and it's not because they love the way I tell stories. It's all about Don. So,
beautiful.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely, Dave. Take care, buddy.